Looking to improve your web application security? Probly is reinventing web application security. Probly focuses on the vulnerabilities that matter, eliminates false positives with evidence-based scanning, and provides a simple point-and-shoot solution that is easy to use. Probly's thorough coverage ensures accurate identification of vulnerabilities in any modern web application or API. Improve your web application security processes by visiting securityweekly.com/Probly and start your free trial today. Whether you need to manage bots, protect cloud applications at runtime, stop formjacking attacks, or secure your web applications and APIs, only Imperva offers a unified solution to protect from edge to application and data in one tool. Imperva helps you achieve more, save money, and become more efficient with fewer security vendors needed. Start a free trial today to easily protect your apps and website with Imperva. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. InfoSec World 2021 is proud to announce its keynote lineup for this year's in-person event. Hear from Robert Herjavec, plus heads of security at the NFL, TikTok, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Stanford University, and more. Plus, Security Weekly listeners save 20% on World Pass and main conference registration. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2021 to register now. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. We are excited to announce our first round of speakers, who are Leslie Carhart, David Kennedy, Alyssa Miller, O'Shea Bowens, Marina Savata, Patrick Coble, Chris Eng, Eric Escobar, Nick Leghorn, Michael Schlatt, Kevin Johnson, and Justin Kohler. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to register and to check out our exciting lineup. And now we have an exciting lineup of news. And the news this week is a lot of Vulns, but a little bit of cloud security in there as well. But I think, as usual, John, let's start off with some vulnerabilities. One was a kind of fun, scary, sad. I'm not sure which adjective I want to throw in there, but it's about ChaosDB and some researchers who hacked a whole bunch of Azure databases, which is pretty interesting because they did it through apparently like Jupyter notebooks. And the reason I say interesting is that from a design perspective, from a security approach, using something like the open source Jupyter notebooks to create a web-based, a browser-based isolation and interaction with data sets seems like the smart approach, but unfortunately, a smart approach can have some security vulnerabilities if it's not implemented correctly. Unfortunately, we don't quite have the technical details of what went wrong here, but it was pretty bad since basically you could get access to just about anyone else's database. So not a good thing.
This is one of the interesting things about open source packages. As a way I'm going to approach this from two different aspects. But the first, most open source stuff, the geeks working on that don't think about multi-tenancy, right? I mean, Kubernetes is just finally starting to get to multi-tenancy. I think with 122 they have some stuff in there. I noticed in commercial versions out there, commercial versions of the ML stuff itself, but really Jupyter. What we're seeing, I'm guessing Microsoft probably took the open source, including the Jupyter server, and then they were trying to make it secure enough. That's just a guess. I obviously we don't know, but that's what results in things like this. There's another open source package I'm looking at using at the new gig, and we're pondering: do we want to write and contribute back that multi-tenancy part itself? So it's a thing, right? I mean, think about it. If you write a type of decently sized application that becomes open source and popular, unless you're thinking about multi-tenancy from the beginning, to go back and add that in at all your checks and balances and user concepts in there, it's a bit of legwork. It's not the easiest thing to do. So I suspect that's probably where the root of this is. But I think the way I'm going to think about it is from the point of view of system hardening, and not caring about the cloud side of it all. But if you are bringing anything into production, and we're going to come back to this with the S3 story later, which is super scary to me. But if you're going to be bringing something into prod, man, you better know what you got. right? You better know what all those bells and whistles are and how you turn things on and off, and what's on that you actually want on in prod versus do you need something off. I haven't used, I got ChaosDB stuck in my head now. I haven't used CosmosDB. The folks that I know who use it love it, including people inside of Microsoft, like at multiple gigs back of mine. They're like, you need to drop the database you guys are using and use this instead. They really love it. It's apparently able to do really great stuff and is really quick and snappy. But unfortunately, things happen, and this is one of them. So yeah, end of the day, before you launch something, I know it's super easy for me to say right now, and I'll probably do it myself in the future. You got to go through and actually understand very carefully what this thing is that you're launching, especially when it's as complex as this.
It is. And I think the only thing I could possibly add there too is that it sounds like Microsoft also had some good logging and auditing so that they were able to say with confidence, here were tenants who were affected by this. Here are others who are potentially affected, in other words, exposed. So in addition to what you're extolling right up front, do the design work, do the multi-tenancy understanding and hardening. But good logging and monitoring can also at least save you from the perspective of being able to answer the question, was I affected or not, or who was I affected, from just being able to, you don't want to answer that question with just a shrug of the shoulders and say, maybe, not sure, don't know, because that's also not a good look. I will hit another quick vuln. I'm not sure there's much to talk about here other than a tie into the last episode. I think I made a offhand comment about not implementing ASN.1 yet again. And here we have a string mishandling within OpenSSL and how C strings are null terminated or length defined strings within ASN.1. And of course, a vulnerability came out of that. It sounds like both that vuln and another vulnerability related to a Shengmi algorithm that probably not a cipher anyone but the Chinese government is using, are both hard to exploit. So it's more of an interesting case of OpenSSL having yet another vuln in kind of a implementation mismatch, sort of like the glibc bug that we talked about last week as well, in the sense of, are you handling a null pointer, but when you go over into the pthread side of the house, maybe there's different assumptions about that API. So a subtle but not uncommon type of coding error in that string handling.
Yeah, I saw this. Mm-hmm. Well, I saw this last week. And what actually stuck in my head, this is, we tried to add color and flavor, and I'm including myself in this with how we discuss some of these stories. And when I saw this one go through during the week, what actually stuck on my head was the font that they're using. So, and in this case, it makes sense because they were trying to point out, the actual version of OpenSSL, which is fixes 1.1.1L Lima, but depending on your font, it looks like 1.1.11. But unfortunately, that's what the part that stuck in my head. It doesn't look like it affected TLS directly. I don't know. This is one of those. I will add a bit of color. We've talked multiple times about OpenSSL and should people be moving to LibreSSL or something else that's a little cleaner. And I'm not knocking the guys that wrote it, right? It's purely just this is a big ball of wax which we've had for the last 20 plus years probably. And it's sort of like glibc. There's just so much stuff in there compared to mlibc that if you can move somewhere else, it's probably in your best interest.
No, absolutely. And I forgot to throw in, I should have thrown this article in there, but I'm going to take a quick tangent. There was an article that I did come across that was basically get paid to improve Linux and open source security. And it's a good tie-in to our segment from last episode as well, about the Linux Foundation that was basically funding open source security work. And one of the things that stood out to me was that they want to improve the Linux kernel's ability to be compiled with Clang. And the reason I'm bringing this up to tie it into OpenSSL is that OpenSSL does have, I think, as you rightly pointed out, John, quite a bit of call it tech debt, call it historical legacy of the original architecture design, the original intent to support a massive but unnecessary amount of different algorithms, especially a massive and potentially unnecessary amount of different chipsets. And there was a lot of hand-rolled assembly that was part of OpenSSL. And getting rid of that is a great attack surface reduction. And the parallel I'm making here with just getting the Linux kernel, for example, to compile cleanly with Clang is something that you go through the code and just get rid of a lot of the warnings, a lot of the cruft, if you will, that builds up over time because the compilers can be your friends. And unfortunately, the compilers weren't able to highlight this misuse of the C string null terminated versus length defined strings. But that's hopefully kind of a future that we're getting towards, or the way that fuzzing perhaps even as part of the build compile process can highlight more effectively, more quickly for us. So I guess there was a little bit more to talk about there rather than just yet another boring C-based memory safety issue in another project.
But that's, it'd be good to add that one into the show notes, because think about it from the point of view of people who are all like, I want to contribute to open source, I want to get into this, but I have no AppSec background. If we can point them at a list of like, here's some, an existing working open source package, but looking at it with a different compiler, and here's how to sort of recognize some of the errors and how to fix them. That seems like a pretty great way for some folks to get involved in that to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to build on that, I threw that into our Discord server, and I'll throw it up in the show notes as well. But it does have an aspect of mentorship to it. You don't need to be a security expert, especially just to go through and do some cleanup of compile warnings from Clang. But these can lead to security benefits. And of course, the article does have some OpenBSD and some other very security-specific projects that they want to fund that would be great to learn on. So we'll definitely highlight. Thank you for that that nudge. I am going to turn to what I think was a little bit more interesting vulnerability, and this was in Bumble dating app. And once again, this kind of this is a neat to me article because it covers what's the metaphor I'm looking for? It closes that gap between just pure technical application security and trust and safety, or the safety of an app. What is the context? Is a callback to what our discussion we just had with Caroline about the impact of that app's security on the user base and who are the users using it. In this case, what a researcher quite cleverly figured out was how to do some more pinpoint tracking of a user's particular location, basically triangulate based on how they would see the app rounding from 3 to 4 miles, for example, but using those flips from a 3 to 4 to say, you are right at this edge of this point. And once you get a couple points to triangulate, or 3 for triangulation, 4 more if you need more, you can get a very specific location of a person. And that, of course, can lead to things like stalking, which, of course, within dating apps should definitely be a concern. So that was a really cool, there was some really cool smart analysis there, as well as another good analysis of the HMAC that was using a client-side secret, which kind of defeats the purpose of using an HMAC, because if everybody knows the secret to calculate this hash, it's not quite providing the same integrity and in non-repudiation that you really want from an HMAC. So there's also a cool thing in the fix for this, but I want to pause there just and see if there was anything on the attack side of things that stood out to you, John.
No, what I like about this actually is that they're not just showing the problem, but they're showing multiple ways to think about how to fix it, right? I like the solution actually, which Tinder had, since they've already gone down this path. I think for those like me who are visual, browsing through this and like just the first the triangulation, like we should be able to figure that out, but like the 3 circles over the map of SF makes it very obvious what's going on, and then very simply just making the lines thicker on those circles. That's a geometric concept if you want to if you can think in that particular mindset, but that's one really great way to fix it, right? It's if you can make the border become more and more fuzzy, that helps saves people's lives, quite honestly, in some cases. So this is a pretty serious thing. unfortunately. But yeah, no, I like this article. It's a fun read to actually. This is very real world. This is very modern day apps. We think about people just using them on a phone, right? This comes back to like when we first started having API security coming on people's minds. What, about 8 years ago? It's probably earlier, but people are like, oh, it's just like it's a mobile app with TLS back to a server. I don't need to worry about the API, right? Everything's safe. But we're seeing now that people are a little more sophisticated in that. So it's a good thought process also for people to think about how do they want to be designing and writing these type of applications.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great write-up. So on that communication side of things, it's just another great thing to read and emulate, to be honest, as well as you were pointing out. Threat models really, 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 I'm going to use 3 reallys there because I think it's important, need to go beyond the OWASP top 10, which is sort of the punching bag we're using for the day, of beyond just, did you use an HMAC? Are you rounding to a single digit to 2-digit? How many decimal points? It's more of what is the impact and how should we protect that? Because the other thing that really was nice about this is that, as you also pointed out, John, is as they were describing what the countermeasures would be, it wasn't just a matter of changing the number of decimal points. It was also really neat to use their words, saying, who should be in your match queue? In other words, who's the potential population that should even be participating in this type of interaction? Now, obviously, in this day and age, it's possible to spoof GPS coordinates, those types of things. But I think that is a smart choice in the sense that it starts to move into the aspect of increasing attacker costs and making it harder for the attacker to get into the specific setting up the machine state, getting into the right context in order to be able to exploit and take advantage of these types of flaws. So great read. Please go take a look at it. And we also linked to another article about Tinder, for example, too. So bunch of great blog posts from this researcher. There is another quick article that I'm going to just jump on real quick because it's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. It's just the top 15 vulnerabilities exploited millions of times to hack Linux systems. Now, unfortunately, this is yet another sort of that straddling the line of marketing and a state of something type of reports that we've seen for the last few years. But what stood out to me is that not only was there a 2013 vulnerability that apparently is still being exploited, but there's a lot of CVEs from 2017, 2018, 2019, and they seem very represented by just a usual suspects of Struts, Drupal, WordPress. So rather than pick on those in specific, because hey, no surprise there, maybe it's just what's the conversation to have around Struts or Drupal or WordPress, if I can pronounce them all correctly, in the spirit of, is there something in their architecture or design that is just making them harder either for patching, or they're just not good software from a security perspective? And that maybe ties into that aspect of when we're talking about, is it time to get off of OpenSSL in favor of modern designs in LibreSSL or Boring or one of those options? So that was kind of the angle that I wanted to take from that particular top 15 list.
I'm just looking through that. Is that 10? No, it was 15. Did I count real quick? 1, 2. I'm counting how many are Java based. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, quite a bit. That's what stood out to me.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'm giving the camera side eye, but for those not looking at that, and also thanks for mentioning Liferay. I needed that flashback. But it's. What else is there to say there, right? Is Struts really being exploited that much was my first thought. Just they're calling that top of the list. And I guess it's sort of by CBSS. Yeah, I'm not sure what else we need to add to this. That to me looks like, I used to say don't use PHP, but that, and I know it's just the language people are using to a large portion. Probably not. I'd say, okay, of those 9, what percentage of that, not that we can figure this out quickly, but what percentage of that would be just because it's Java? Or is it because there's a certain style of coding which people do in Java? Or, and I mean, I'm being unfair here because a lot of those are struts. But you've also got, did I see WebLogic in here? And Jetty. Yeah, so it's, I mean, that smells a lot like a Java issue to me. And that doesn't sound right. But at the same time, that's what this list looks like.
Yeah, I see where you're going there. And I did make a comment, too, in the show notes that even on WordPress, of course, PHP, but WordPress core tends to be actually pretty secure. And I'm sure our listeners will tell me if I'm wrong here, but I can't recall a impactful CVE or CVSS in the WordPress core in the last several years, to be honest.
Yeah.
They've all been in plugins, and it's the plugins where I think it's getting to that kind of where the path you were going down there, John, is that, is there a design pattern? Is there just that the fact that the plugin architecture isn't conducive to being able to have granular access? In other words, one little flaw is an all or nothing now. You get the equivalent of you've got root, essentially, if you can break a poorly implemented WordPress plugin. And that's kind of what I think is a way, at least I try to steer that conversation, especially if you're trying to figure out, should we adopt this? Should we not adopt this? Or if you're an internal AppSec team looking at your own legacy systems or your own current systems, are we seeing a lot of vulns, and why? Is the root cause because we just forgot to do something, or is the root cause because we don't have a framework that's protecting us from cross-site scripting, from CSRF? And unfortunately, the next OWASP Top 10 is going to read like that familiar list that Caroline was pointing out, and SQL injection, cross-site scripting, CSR, and I'm going to put all of our listeners and myself to sleep as I read those once again after, 2 decades of the same thing.
Mike's new bedtime stories. Sorry. Oh man, I had a thought there. It was better in just a snark. So going back to spending another 30 seconds on this, think about what we were describing, that previous article, the Microsoft database and hardening. I used to run professionally, commercially, WordPress hosting, and it really, to me, it came down to defense and depth. So if you think about a lot of the things on here, okay, RCE. If you got an RCE in an application, if you're deploying an application which might have an RCE, how would you protect the rest of your applications from that, if it's multi-tenant or not? If you've got, these are mostly RCE. If you've got a information disclosure, how would you minimize what type of information is being disclosed? Deserialization. Okay, my argument's falling apart. That's purely AppSec. But on a lot of these, the point being, it's not just defending, or not just either picking the right WordPress plugin or hardening it correctly or trying to make sure it's patched, but also what does the rest of that stack look like? If you've got a database and you've got a database with a bunch of WordPress accounts, WordPress sites, so hopefully they'll all have different database logins, right, with different actual permissions to the database. So if you do get through to SQLi, you're only getting to your own database, not to everyone else's. So there's a lot of things like that I think, again, think about that when you guys are building and deploying.
Yeah, and I think so. So let's go on a journey to the opposite end of the spectrum here, John. I picked up 2 articles from the recent TLDRSec newsletter. So thanks, Clint, for helping me out there. And one is Cloud Security Orienteering, which is a good high-level kind of strategy about approaching cloud security. And to me, it was also just a collection of great links to reading that link out to a lot of other things that need to be read. That is made a big, long bedtime reading list for me. But the other thing, let's talk about that S3 security document, because you alluded to that in the beginning. Now, I have a couple feelings about this thing. For one, we have, an S3 security document. Somebody did a great deep dive and came up with, once again, I forgot to prep our fantastic video, AV gents, and to say, drum roll, please. So what is someone with 163 pages? Thank you, John. 163 pages of S3 security. This is clearly useful to someone, but clearly I think you don't take this 163 pages and throw it over the DevOps team and say, here's the product security team's requirements, go follow this, because no one's going to read it. No one cares. So I think the discussion here is more about how do we respond and react, and how do we distill this into something that's very brief and actionable for that product for the DevOps team to follow on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the people this is useful. It's useful to two people. One, trust on cloud because they're trying to sell a product.
Right.
I'm not familiar with them in any way, shape, or form, so I'm not. I'm just saying that's what they're doing. Let's be honest. And then second, this is very useful to consultants or auditors who are billing hourly. I first saw that list when we were rolling into the show, into the news segment, and Johnny was probably wondering while I was on mute, what was I screaming and making faces off? And that's when I saw that first it was probably about an 8 or 9, probably 8-point document font, 8-point font in the doc is the main thing. And then, hot damn, it's actually 163 pages long. I mean, this is completely, I'm sure it's useful. I'm not going to say the opposite, but there was a comment in the blog post which points to it saying it's broken into 32, 34 different areas, 32. What do you do besides throw your hands in the air on that one? You can automate or get someone else's automated or hopefully have. This could be an interesting point to have. There's all these products out there in ISC space for all these products out there for securing ISC, and hell, I used to work at one. But wouldn't it make sense to actually have a growing collection of ISC pattern libraries that say, here's how you use S3 securely, or here's how you use deploy an EC2 instance with automatic patching, or RGS, or hey, let's talk about Cosmos with everything turned off except what you want. So why don't we actually, as an industry or even as a community, come up with patterns like that? So not every individual person has to go and harden this crap every single time. Hopefully that's a more useful rant than usual, but come on. Even if 10 people read all 163 pages, you've wasted so much time here. And I'm not saying it's not valuable, right? It's super valuable, but let's try and fix the problem at the beginning instead of having everyone to read this. I think that's the only way to attack this. I think I don't know. Tell me I'm wrong, please.
Yeah, I don't have the heart to do it because I don't think they're too off base, quite honestly. I think what I'd love to see here is that theme of review your exposure of your S3 buckets, make them private by default at the account level. And if you can enforce that through IAC, all the better. And then have a discussion with your developers and between your developers and your AppSec team to say, how sensitive is the data in here? What should be our encryption approach? Should we just use the default bucket encryption? Should we do some client managed keys so that only the services that are dropping the data into there have access to decrypt the data? Otherwise, you're just looking at blobs. And for example, we'll do a callback to, 2020, the Capital One breach got into an S3 bucket, but the content inside the bucket was additionally encrypted. So you actually would have had to get to the decryption keys to access it. And I realize that took me maybe 60 seconds to describe, but quite honestly, I think those are 2 points that I would distill out of these 163 pages. And then if I'm pressed to follow the rule of threes, I'd say, cool, let's turn on some logging so that we can get some access auditing so we can see what services touched it and what data went in and what data went out. And let's move on and do something constructive and build with our time because it's a long PDF. But
and I think just 2 seconds on there. Amazon has gone through a lot of, this S3 used to be the poster boy for a while for people to hack on. And I think they've done a pretty good job of securing it by default. It's not 100% there, as you mentioned. I can't remember, is encryption on by default? Pop quiz. I can't remember if it's off and you can turn it on. And no, I think it's on by default, but then you can pick a key, right? So they're getting better at some of these things. The thought process there for people is if you are using your own key, and that's going to be in, say, either a parameter store or secret store, is your app written in such a way that if someone can get in, they can't go and grab that secret from the secret store from the app and then use it to decrypt what's in S3? That's where this stuff gets complicated, but every little bit helps.
Every little bit helps. And actually, there is a tie-in between the ChaosDB article and what you're describing there. And those same researchers had another talk at Black Hat where they were discussing more of a call to action, saying we need a CVE for cloud vulnerabilities. And I think what they're really getting to is that there are common misconfigurations. And then a lot of the cloud service providers, we're talking about AWS, I'll use Amazon as an example. Amazon did come out and they changed their metadata service, so it's more resistant to SSRF, whereas GCP had already had countermeasures for that, and they did that, actually, speaking of, in reaction to the Capital One breach. Amazon also made it so that I think I'm correct to say, by default, you will be notified, or you have to make your S3 buckets public. So they're doing some changes for those secure defaults. But there's a long tail of all of these existing tenants, to use our word of the day, that haven't necessarily made those changes. So it's one of those things to say the cloud service providers might be improving, but if you haven't gone back and changed your old configurations back to these new and better defaults, you're still going to be vulnerable. So there is something to be said there between IAC, these cloud posture management, how to go and find and fix those, the nature of those particular vulnerabilities.
And I think,
speaking of, go ahead.
Briefly on that one, it was something I was going to mention. We were talking to Carolyn, and we ran out of time. We could have gone for another 90 minutes. See if I can make this tightly packaged. A lot of stuff that both she was talking and what you're sort of saying there right now, that's great if you are just picking something off the shelf and using it, right? Because then the best practices, whatever, apply to you. If you've got someone who's either reinventing, or they're doing something specific, or they've got like really specific use cases why they don't want to use Etsy, like one of my best friends he's hugely customized, and I have to admit I helped him, Drupal, to be able to do all sorts of customizations on products in the shopping cart that was in Drupal. And it's so customized that now he can't actually pick it up and move to a more modern platform like Shopify. How does someone like that actually keep that type of thing secure, right? So this is when we go in and we start tinkering with open source, this is one of the things which will bite you. If you don't push those changes back upstream, you're now supporting that bad boy for as long as you're using that thing. But that also makes it more difficult to secure. So, that's a big thing to keep in mind. It's very simple to say, but think about it. If you're doing something that's not just shooting and taking that puzzle piece and using it, but you're actually doing something custom with it, you're creating a lot of late nights for yourself.
Well, speaking of things that are simple to say, but possibly take a lot more effort, there's a final article that you pointed out here, John, about Linux 5.14 kernel update. And the easy part to say is that it will include security and performance improvements. But I think that is a lot more engineering work that went under the hood there about what actually it took to make these improvements. So help us understand what those are.
Yeah, I actually wanted to go and read some of the patches on this, and I haven't yet, unfortunately. But the big one, which is going to be, it's funny because I saw this article on TechCrunch, which shows what Google News is feeding me instead of some of the more security sites. But still, I love TechCrunch. I'm probably spending a lot of time on there, and that's why. But think about, over the last few years, one of our biggest stories was Spectre and Meltdown, right? The ability to not so much poison a cache on a CPU, but use the capability of forward lookup and predictive lookup of your execution pipelines to be able to improve performance. And that was provided a vector to be able to see what other parts of the application or other data sets could be in that cache. So they've now come up with a way to try and minimize that by allowing a caller to specify that different, I'll say, trust boundaries don't execute on applications in different trust areas don't execute on the same CPU core. So, right, that's what was going on with Spectre and Meltdown is since you're sharing a core along with potentially the predictive or speculative pipeline, that's what gets you into that particularly messy area. So being able to actually specify, hey, I don't want these two processes to run on that same core and actually separate them to different places, that should be able to mitigate a pretty good amount of this. I think that's the big one to me, and I think that's pretty neat.
Absolutely. I don't think I have anything good to add. That was a great summary. So with that, I will say thank you to Mr. Kinsella for joining us once again. Thanks to everybody who was in Discord and hanging out with us. We have a break next week, which means you have a chance to catch up on our past episodes and a chance to take a moment to like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And with that, we'll see you in 2 weeks on Application Security Weekly.